Hello children, and welcome to tonight's bedtime story. I'm putting Hermione to bed and she's with her little baby Imogen. Good night Hermione, good night Imogen, and tonight we're going to read the story of Mr. Biff the boxer. There was once a man named Mr. Bob. Mr. Bob was a boxer. He was as fit as a fiddle, and he was the toughest man in town. He was the champion. There was another boxer in town. His name was Mr. Biff. And it looks like he liked reading newspapers. Mr. Biff was not as fit as a fiddle. He ate too many cream cakes. He drank too many bottles of beer. Mr. Biff was not tough. He liked to sit in an easy chair by a cosy fire. He liked to put his slippers on and read the paper. He slept in a feather bed. One day, posters appeared in town. They said, "Big charity fight! Mr. Biff against Mr. Bob!" Mr. Biff told his wife about the fight. "It's for charity," he said. "We can raise lots of money for a good cause. Me against Mr. Bob." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Biff. "They say he's the toughest man in the town. They say his wife is the toughest woman too," said Mr. Biff. Mrs. Biff told the children about the fight. "It's for charity," she said. "Your dad against Mr. Bob." "Our dad will win," said Billy Biff. "He will biff him," Betty Biff said. "But your daddy's not fit," said Mrs. Biff, "and he is not tough." He will be his trainers then," said Billy Biff. "And toughen him up," Betty Biff said. "You wait and see." The next day, Mr. Bob began training. His family helped. Billy Biff took him running. Betty Biff took him skipping. Salt, mustard, vinegar, pepper. Salt, mustard, vinegar, pepper. Mrs. Biff hid his paper and his slippers. Bonzo Biff kept him out of the easy chair. Run, 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 run. The children also helped toughen him up. Mrs. Biff helped to toughen him up too. Mr. Biff was put on a diet. "I'd like 3 cream cakes and a bottle of beer," he said. "You can have 3 carrots and a glass of water," said Mrs. Biff. Each day the children said, "How do you feel, Dad?" Each day Mr. Biff said, "I feel terrible." But one day the children said, "How do you feel, Dad?" And Mr. Biff said, "I feel as fit as a fiddle." Da-da-da-da. Now it was the day of the fight. A big tent was put up in town. Everybody was excited. Crowds gathered. The referee stepped in the ring. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," he said, "on my right, Mr. Bob." "That's my husband," said Mrs. Bob. "On my left, Mr. Biff." Everybody cheered. "That's my dad," Billy Biff shouted. The time king rang the bell. Ding, ding. The fight began. Mr. Biff stepped forward. Mr. Bob stepped forward. Mr. Bob moved to the right. Mr. Biff moved to the left. Suddenly, Mr. Bob biffed Mr. Biff. Oh! At the same time, Mr. Biff boffed Mr. Bob. There was lots of biffing and boffing and boffing and biffing. They biffed and boffed each other out. "It's a draw," the referee said. The time king rang the bell. Ding, ding. The fight was ended. 9, 10, out. It's a draw. In the dressing room, Mr. Biff said, "How do you feel?" "I feel terrible," said Mr. Bob. "I think bopping people is silly." "Biffing people is silly too," said Mr. Biff. Then Mr. Bob said, "I feel hungry as well." "I've been on a diet." "Me too," said Mr. Biff. "I could just eat a cream cake now and a jam tart," said Mr. Bob. "And fish and chips, and chicken fried rice, and some noodles. And why don't we go to KFC as well? And roast chicken and potatoes, and peas and bread and butter, and a bottle of beer," Mr. Bob said. So that evening, the two families went out for a big dinner. Mrs. Biff made friends with Mrs. Bop. The Biff children made friends with the Bop children. That's a nice hat, Mrs. Bop. Cheers. Say when Bonzo Biff shared a bone with Bop the dog, and a happy time was had by all. The end. Good night, Hermione!